This is TechSNAP, episode 418, for December 13th, 2019. Hello and welcome to TechSNAP, Jupiter Broadcasting Systems, Network, and Administration podcast. My name is Wes, and of course, I'm joined by Jim. Hello, Jim.
What's up, Wes?
Before we get started today, Jim, I've got some good news. If you're listening to this, well, you've got one day left for our Black Friday promotion over at Linux Academy. Yeah, that's right. The promotion's been extended through Friday the 13th, so if you haven't got in on it, now's the time to do so. If you're listening to TechSNAP, you're probably interested in Linux, AWS, Azure, GCP, DevOps, probably containers, and of course, security. And right now, we're running that annual Black Friday promotion for a limited time that takes $150 off a full year of unlimited training. Visit learn.linuxacademy.com/Jupiter to get a full year of training for just $299. That's learn.linuxacademy.com/Jupiter. Well, Jim, we've heard lots about 5G over the last couple of years, but it looks like we might actually be starting to see it in our real everyday devices. I noticed earlier this month, T-Mobile launched its 600 megahertz quote-unquote 5G across the US, although at the time they launched it, there weren't any phones that could use it. That's changed now, but I think it kind of highlights a trend that we've seen so far in 5G. Lots of hype, lots of terms, but for a long time, starting with at&t, there's been some confusion about what is 5G, what counts as 5G, and how do we know if we actually have it?
Yeah, there's still a lot of confusion about that. I think part of the worst of it is that everybody wants to tout the amazing advantages of 5G when what they really mean is 5G FR2, not 5G FR1. And what that's all about is there's a frequency 1 and a frequency 2. Frequency 1 is sub 6 gigahertz 5G, and that's the same, basic spectrum range that our existing 4G LTE runs on, and it shares most of the same RF propagation characteristics. There's nothing radically new about 5G FR1. It has the potential to scale a little bit better in more dense urban environments and timeshare a little bit better, but it's just not really groundbreaking.
Right. According to T-Mobile's claims, in some places, 600 megahertz 5G will be a lot faster than LTE, but in others, customers won't see much of a difference. And I guess that's what you're saying, right? In dense urban environments, some of the new algorithms that are taking place on the same old frequency bands as LTE might have an impact, but by and large, it just can't be that much different because it's the same frequency range.
Well, Wes, I'm also pretty cynical because this is still, at this point, pretty unproven technology. And, we're seeing a lot of wild claims about how great it will be and how much better of a job it will do. But we don't really know until we see it actually deployed in the wild and, see what changes, if any, there are. 4G was also shockingly fast when it was first deployed. And the reason it was so shockingly fast is almost nobody was on it. By the time it becomes the mainstream, most widely adopted technology, then that initial advantage of I'm one of the 500 people in my major metro area who are using this frequency, that's gone because now you're sharing it with a couple million other people. The same thing is going to happen with 5G FR1, and it may or may not be significantly better. And I'm not willing to blindly trust anybody's assertions until we see how it actually does.
I like that approach.
FR1 is not the 5G that most people are hearing, these amazing claims about how super fast and low latency it is. That's 5G FR2. FR2 is also known as millimeter wave 5G. It's extremely high frequency. We're talking the 24 gigahertz range, and its propagation characteristics are very, very different. The millimeter wave 5G FR2, it's only good to about 1 mile with clear line of sight from tower to receiver. And it won't penetrate buildings or walls or windows. As a matter of fact, even if you turn around and get your head in between your phone and the nearest FR2 tower, that may be enough to interrupt the signal. It also doesn't work well with moving targets. You need to be, stationary and not moving around much. FR2 does actually have the potential to be a pretty great technology, but not in your phone. It's more of a site-to-site link kind of thing.
Right. So you might use this around the city to connect office buildings or apartment buildings to upstream, or a different use case.
Well, and to be fair, not just in the city. I mean, it would be amazing out in a rural environment as well, where, you might have, let's say you might have 20, maybe 30 homes within a mile of, a hill that you can put a tower on. And you can put up that tower and have a very stable, high bandwidth point-to-point link from each of those houses to the tower without having to dig miles and miles of, trenches to put cable in. That's a big deal.
You mentioned high speed there, Jim. How fast are we talking with 5G? At least 5G FR2.
Well, Wes, how fast your link might be with 5G FR2 is dependent on a lot of things. It depends on the exact channel that you're using. It can depend on atmospheric conditions, and it depends on the modulation you're using. Like, are you doing 64 cam or 256 cam? What's your scaling factor? Yada, 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 yada. At the end of the day, you might be looking at real world throughput of somewhere around 2 gigabits. But again, that's FR2. FR1, it's another one of those things that it sounds really impressive until you look at what came before. 5G FR1 is capable of a gigabit, which sounds amazing until you realize so is 4G.
So what are we really gaining here? Is this more about latency?
Well, Wes, if you're talking about FR2, you can have extremely low latency. The air latency may be as low as like 8 to 10 milliseconds on FR2. With FR1, the lowest possible latency isn't really very different than it was with 4G. However, in theory, due to better time sharing in really densely saturated environments, you may still see lower real-world latencies in the middle of like a crowded city block. But again, we kind of have to be a little skeptical here and just see what it looks like when it gets here. Wes, what we haven't talked about yet is how and why 5G absolutely actually will make your brand new flagship phone suck more this year than it did the last year.
Wait, make it suck more? Shouldn't it make it faster, better, lower latency, Jim?
Well, so the problem is that, Qualcomm has released the specs on next year's Snapdragon, and it's not only not going to have the 5G modem built into the system on chip, it's going to be an external modem. It's also moving the 4G modem out of the actual processor die and, into an external device again. And that's going to mean higher power consumption, more heat generation, lower battery life, whether you're using 4G or 5G.
Is there a legitimate reason on the Qualcomm side to want to make this move? Especially considering most people will probably still be using LTE primarily?
I have a lot of trouble coming up with one other than, wanting to even the playing field between 4G and 5G and not give the existing 4G systems a leg up on the newer 5G ones that, that will have to be off die.
So this is a push for 5G, basically.
That's the only way I can really interpret it. You can't really deploy a 5G only phone right now. There's not enough networks anywhere, and that would make a lot of people angry. Out of those people who didn't know enough to buy one, they'd be very mad very quickly. So right now, you're going to have both 5G and 4G on every phone, and I guess they just didn't have enough room for both a 5G and 4G modem on die with the CPU. So they said, well, if you can't have one, you can't have the other either.
So what are the actual implications of that? How far away is it? Is it going to make things slower, or is it just worse battery life?
I've seen some speculation that it's going to make speed slower, but I don't really think I buy into that. There's no getting around that it will increase power consumption and heat generation and therefore decrease your battery life, but I don't really see any reason to expect lower speeds. Wes, one interesting question about this is, I think it's a fairly low chance, but there is some chance for this to help unseat Qualcomm as the undisputed flagship Android processor king. There are other folks building ARM CPUs that go in phones right now. Samsung has their Exynos line. Now, those don't get deployed to phones in the US. Those are only going into overseas phones right now. But so there's Samsung's Exynos, MediaTek builds CPUs for phones, and Apple's building their own ARM CPUs.
It reminds me of our desktop and server processing world where we've recently seen with Intel, a few stumbles can go a long way for your competitors.
They really can. One thing in particular to watch out for there, Wes, is Intel and MediaTek have partnered up recently on building 5G into ARM CPUs via the Helios M70 modem.
I thought Intel was getting out of the modem game.
Well, it's a little complicated. They actually did get out of the consumer 5G modem game, but now they're partnering with MediaTek. MediaTek designs them and builds them, but Intel has input on the initial specifications, and they also get involved in qualification afterwards and in designing the software drivers to run them.
Ah, okay. This is complicated.
It is complicated, and I think it's going to be a really great move for both companies. Intel clearly needed to tighten their hardware focus. Frankly, MediaTek can use Intel's help with brand recognition and, maybe just a little of the old QA. MediaTek makes an awful lot of parts, but they don't necessarily always have the best reputation because where MediaTek falls down is the integration. I don't think Intel's going to let that continue to be a weak point in a device that they're partnered up on. This Intel-MediaTek collaboration, it's not for smartphone processors. It's actually for peripherals that could go into, general purpose PC equipment. But I still think it's a really interesting partnership that could go a long way.
Well, keeping on the mobile front, Jim, we've got some good news and an update to a story we've talked about before. It looks like the Librem 5 has actually made it into the hands of some backers.
Can confirm, Wes. I was very happy to see that one of the readers over at Ars Technica got their Birch Librem 5 phone right around Thanksgiving, right when Weaver promised that they should start arriving.
Okay, so you mentioned Birch there. Can you remind us all about how this process is actually working and some of the differences that backers might get now versus devices we're expecting in the future?
Yeah, it's important to remember that the Librem 5, you don't buy it at a store. It's a crowd-funded product. It still doesn't actually exist as a full retail device. And the backers are getting phones in 5 batches. Librem has a fancy tree name for every one of them, but I'm just going to go ahead and go, old school military phonetic and say Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo. Birch is the B out of that A to E progression. In theory, at first, backers are supposed to start receiving phones with the initial batch, the Aspen. But those only ended up going to, employees of the company and some unspecified insiders, presumably under an NDA, because absolutely no pictures or any report of anything with Aspen came out from anybody but Brian Lunduke, who was working for the company as their PR person at the time. Birch is the next batch after Aspen, and the initial shipping window for Birch had come and gone, and nobody had received any Birch phones. And, there was a lot of kind of ugly rumor mill floating around, that, nobody's gotten any phones yet. Nobody confirmed anybody has received one. What's going on? So, I put on my Ars Technica reporter hat and got hold of the CEO, Todd Weaver, and asked what was going on with that. And long story short is basically the back half of the Birch shipment, about 100 of those phones did actually go out to backers. And one of those was an Ars Technica reader who was kind enough to share some pictures and some thoughts and, some stories about his experiences with it.
Yeah, if you want to go see those pictures, we'll have Jim's write-up linked over at techsnap.system/418. From what you can tell, Jim, what's the experience like with one of these Birch units?
Well, that kind of depends on your perspective, Wes. If you're going in with a Birch unit and you're expecting to have a fully functional phone, you're going to be wildly unhappy. The phone can't really effectively make calls right now because the audio cuts out when you try to make a phone call, something that will have to be fixed in software later. The mechanical experience, I haven't actually had my hands on one yet. I'm hoping that will happen in the next week or two. But, according to our reader who did get one of the Birch phones, it's pretty good. The phone feels sexy in your hand. It is noticeably thick, but, it's chamfered on the back, and it apparently fits really well in the hand. The biggest problem right now, if you're willing to hand wave that you can't make calls on this phone and look at it as just sort of it's a relatively high performance, Linux device that fits in your pocket with a touch screen and a battery. The battery is a real problem. It was supposed to be a 3,500 milliamp hour battery, and the one that our reader received only had a 2,000 milliamp hour battery in it, and absolutely none of the power optimization has been done yet. So, we're talking a runtime that's in minutes, not hours.
Yeah, okay, that sounds difficult. I will say, though, that I am somewhat interested in a little Linux device I could keep in the back of my pocket and actually have full control over. I don't know that I would want to replace my Android phone anytime soon. And obviously, right now, I practically couldn't. But I only really use Android as an appliance, and I love having something I could play with more.
Absolutely, Wes. I mean, I'm a Librem 5 backer myself, and that's exactly what I'm really looking forward to. I never really had a whole lot of faith that it would replace, my Android flagship phone as a daily driver for a phone. But, as just a digital Swiss Army knife that I could stick in my pocket and be able to do some of the things that are getting increasingly difficult on newer versions of Android, like scan Wi-Fi networks, it sounds pretty cool to me. Anyway, moving on and addressing some of your other questions about the batches. We talked about Aspen and Birch, but basically the separate batches just get a little bit more polished with each one. Evergreen, the last one, that's going to be the first actual retail product. Everything prior to Evergreen, the A through D batches, those are all prototypes. Those batches don't have FCC certification for the phone as a unit, only for the individual radios. And they actually only even can be given to people as prototypes.
So we're not even in the phase yet where these can really be considered products.
No, they're not. I mean, technically, you literally cannot buy one right now. It would be an FCC violation if they were to sell you one. You can get access to a prototype as one of the producers of the product, but they can't sell them retail. All right, Wes, so we covered batches A through E, and that was the full set of initial shipment batches that ends with Evergreen, the final retail product that's fully FCC licensed. All the hardware stuff is done, all the software is working, the whole nine. Purism has also added an F batch. I don't know, probably Fur. Fur is an unspecified, quote, next generation, unquote, that's just supposed to be newer and better and different. But literally, as far as I'm aware, nothing concrete has been said about that other than that it will be a new batch.
Maybe a catch-all at the end to a place to apply lessons learned along the way with the other batches?
It does, or if you're really cynical, that could serve as just, evidence that they're running low on cash and they need to keep getting people to pre-order so they can keep the company running until they really do have retail sales and, not just shipping prototypes to early backers. The other thing along those lines is, and I got to be honest, I really want this project to succeed. I got my own personal money in it, and I want my Librem 5 to get here and be great. But the company announced a made in the USA version of the Librem, where all the parts and assembly and everything else will only happen in the United States. That is, the idea is this is supposed to alleviate supply chain attack concerns for very security-minded people.
Right. If you're very paranoid, you really need your privacy and security intact. Well, you have a little more assurance here that at least it's stayed in the country.
Yeah. But the price, the Librem 5 is already pretty overpriced for what it is at $700. $700 is what it cost me to back it. It's what the phone is expected to retail for, when you're literally just buying them. The USA Librem 5 is $2,000.
Wow.
For the same phone.
Oh, it's the same phone. That's not like there's a upgrades plan.
No, there's no upgrade. It's just all made in the USA. And it strikes me as kind of sketchy to suddenly be announcing that we're doing this and you can pre-order this thing now that costs almost 3 times as much as the regular one, despite being the same thing, despite still not actually having a product yet. It's just, it's weird.
Well, this seems like another case of a project we'll have to keep our eyes on. When do we expect the next batch to go out?
I'm not really sure about the next batch, and I kind of hate to speculate about that one. There were only, and again, according to Weaver, roughly 100 phones that went out to backers in Birch. I don't think I forget the tree names, but I don't think Charlie and Delta are going to be a whole lot different in that. There should be somewhat larger numbers of backers receiving those phones, but I still don't think it's going to be huge. Weaver said that the majority of the thousands of orders that they have are going to go out in Evergreen. And he said that he is expecting Evergreen right now around March, which I wouldn't bet anything you couldn't afford to lose on that. Wes, I do want to take this opportunity to remind everybody, when you see a crowd-funded project on Kickstarter or Indiegogo, or even some companies, own completely running solo effort to crowdfund something, that's not a store. you're not looking at buying a product. You're looking at producing one. You're taking the job of production, meaning funneling money into a direction that you think will be interesting for the industry. That's what you're doing, is making that investment to help influence where an industry goes. You may or you may not ever get an actual concrete product out of that. If that's not a level of risk that you're willing to take, or that's not something that you're interested in doing, you absolutely should not participate. With that said, Librem is, in my opinion, moving the telephony industry in a very interesting direction with its embrace of, completely open source and freedom respecting technologies, both software and hardware. And even if I don't get a Librem 5, I'm actually not going to regret my $700 investment, because they have contributed so much software work upstream that I fully believe it will help a lot of other projects down the road, no matter what ultimately happens with the Librem 5 itself.
I'll certainly be curious to see how this goes. And like you said, we're hoping this works out. It's obviously a difficult task that Purism is taking on here. Hopefully we'll have a handy Linux device that fits in your pocket that also respects your freedom sometime soon. Well, when you do get your hands on a Librem device, you're probably going to be using it on Wi-Fi, at least to start. So probably want your Wi-Fi to be pretty darn good. There's been a mesh Wi-Fi system out there, kind of one of the earlier well-known systems, and I've been secretly waiting for you to do a review, Jim. We actually have one of these systems here at the studio, and we've been pretty happy with it. So I was curious what you would think, notable Wi-Fi skeptic and tester extraordinaire. What am I talking about? Well, of course, it's eero.
Wes, I've always liked eero. I haven't always been real sure where it stood in terms of, the whole price to performance slider, but the devices themselves have always had good hardware design. They've had, good furniture design. They've never made anything ugly that you wouldn't want to have in your home.
That's an important factor.
Yeah, and people have responded really well to the app design. It's an overall really well-rounded product. Now, when Amazon acquired eero, they actually mandated some changes in hardware design that ended up being a really good idea. eero had gotten, maybe a little too funky, a little bit too expensive. The first generation eero were just basically, little flat white lozenges, and they were all identical. Now, the second generation of eero, and this is still prior to the Amazon acquisition, they made a change, and they had eero routers and they had eero beacons. The eero router was a tri-band device. It looked a lot like the first generation eero. And the beacon was something that plugged directly into wall outlets. It had no Ethernet jacks on it. It was Wi-Fi backhaul only. And it had a funky little nightlight on it. Greatly to my surprise, you hear something like it and you're like, a nightlight, great, who wants that? Greatly to my surprise, the nightlight actually looked great on those things. It was really attractive. It could be disabled if you didn't want it, but it looked really good, and it made a really good amount of ambient, very soft, yellowish white light, that could help you not trip over things in a room at night.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind that. And if it gives me Wi-Fi, great.
Yeah, it was legitimately a cool design. Unfortunately, it was expensive to manufacture. So eero plus 2 beacons was definitely a crowd pleaser. They sold a lot of these units, but they were pretty costly. It was $400 for that 3-piece kit. And, they weren't really on the top of the pile performance-wise because the beacons were dual band only. They had no Ethernet jacks. They did well. They were reliable. But it was, more that I don't mind spending a little bit more, and, I want just kind of an overall well-rounded product.
Yeah, a little more premium.
Yeah, it wasn't what you would choose either for I want the best possible performance or, I want a really inexpensive kit. Now, when Amazon acquired eero, they made some changes. They said these things are just too expensive to manufacture. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, no, we want you to make all 3 devices be the same thing. So there's no 2 separate product lines. We can just throw these things out en masse with a 3-piece kit consisting of all the same thing. We're going to have Ethernet jacks on all 3 of them. All 3 are going to be dual band. We're going to get rid of that nightlight because it was too expensive to manufacture. So now what we've got is we've got little white lozenges again. They're a little thicker than the first or the second generation eero, but they're all, desktop mount. They all have 2 gigabit Ethernet jacks. They're all dual band. And because of that streamlining of the process, man, they are cheap. When they're not on sale, a kit of 3 pieces of these Amazon eeros goes for $250. That's as low as a Deco M5, which was, my big budget pick before this. On sale right now, you can get these things for $190 for a 3-piece with an Echo Dot thrown in for free.
That's a price per unit that's hard to beat.
It really is. I mean, we're talking now about a price that is down almost as low as TP-Link wired access points.
All right. Well, if the price is pretty good, we also need to know about the performance. How does the eero deliver?
It's really surprisingly good, given what we're talking about. I mean, we're talking about a very inexpensive kit. We're talking about a dual band only kit. Not even the router is tri-band. So I expected it to be decent because it's eero and they haven't really made anything that wasn't decent. But I was kind of blown away with how well it did. I have a really nasty torture test that I do over at Ars Technica now. Yeah. I set up 4 laptops all around a very large house, and I have all 4 of them simultaneously streaming video and doing my web browsing latency test at the same time. Now, I do these tests 2 different ways, and one of them, all 4 laptops are streaming 1080p. That's only a 5 megabit stream, but it's enough that it really puts pressure on the network, and you frequently start seeing some pretty bad latency times in the simultaneous web browsing tests. The really ugly torture test is 4K to all 4 laptops. Now, that means 20 megabits apiece times 4 to pass the streaming side of it, and you've got to do respectable web browsing, with low times to load web pages on top of that. Greatly to my surprise, eero managed it.
That's tough because there's a lot to manage at the network level. You've got all this data that has to actually make it through. And at the same time, you want to have good latency with respect to other consumers on the same network.
I never expected eero to actually pass that one. When I first designed the 4K torture test, I didn't think anything was going to pass it. I mean, that's a lot to ask. 4 separate 4K streams, and you want web browsing latency to be good all over the house while that's going on? That's nuts.
Right, that's a workload I would think, well, I'm just going to have to go wired.
Yeah, the Plume SuperPods managed it, and I was impressed when they did it with, much more hardware-capable tri-band access points and more of them. My Plume SuperPod kit had 4 pieces. The eero is dual band only and 3 pieces and only cost, like I said, $250 with no sale, $190 right now. And don't get me wrong, it's not even coming close to knocking the SuperPods off of the top of the mesh performance heap. But being able to deliver that experience competently for that low of a price, yeah, I was impressed.
Okay, well, do they have any tricks up their sleeve then? How are they doing so well?
I think it really boils down, Wes, to, having had several years to really refine their Wi-Fi game, not being focused on price, being focused instead on making a really solid, technically innovative product, and then getting acquired by Amazon and having Amazon bring their this is how we make things less expensive expertise in on top of that. You kind of get the best of both worlds.
It has retained a little of its former character, at least in the fact that you've got to use an app to manage it, right? I mean, that may be different for people who are used to more web GUI-based devices.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Wes, that's true of almost all of the mesh kits out there. If you're allergic to the cloud and you just want something that you can set up with no internet connection whatsoever, you just want to browse into a local IP address with a web browser and operate the product, the only 2 mesh choices I'm aware of are Netgear Orbi or D-Link Cover. And Orbi is really the only one of the 2 you should be considering because while Cover does perform pretty well, the price to performance ratio is not good, and there are some serious irritants with the user interface and the management on Cover.
Well, what did you think of the app, right? You've used it a little bit. You've deployed it in your own home. And you're, let's say a classic sysadmin type. I can't imagine it would be a natural fit for you.
No, it's not my favorite. I like a full-featured experience of sitting down at the desktop and, getting the interface up on the big monitor and yada, yada, yada. But I will say, as phone-based app management goes of a Wi-Fi system, eero's app is on point, man. It was incredibly easy to set up. I was done with the entire process in under 10 minutes for all 3 pieces. And the app is very discoverable. It's easy to navigate and find all the things and the bits and the bobs and use them and make them go. The other thing I will say that did actively irritate me about eero is there are, it's got some family filtering features, and those are hidden behind a paywall. You need to pay, and it's not a whole lot of money. You got to pay $30 a year if you want to, filter your kids' internet access.
Okay.
I don't mind that part so much, but what really did irritate me, I felt like it was a cheap cash grab. One of the features that gets enabled for that $30 a year is being able to force safe search on Google. Now, that's not work that eero is doing. That is literally all on the Google side. And hiding that part behind the paywall, I didn't like that at all.
We've got another update to something we've talked about quite regularly on this program, and this time it's some great news. It looks like WireGuard is finally getting closer to landing in the mainline Linux kernel.
WireGuard! Yeah, Wes, I'd say at this point it's a lock. It got pulled into David Miller's NetNext kernel source tree, and when the 5.6 kernel development stage goes live, NetNext gets pulled into the tree and becomes Net, and that's the networking stack. So barring something going incredibly, tragically unforeseen wrong, we're going to have WireGuard built into mainline 5.6 kernels.
Can you remind us a little bit about why it took so long? I mean, WireGuard has been pretty great since the first day it was announced, and it seems like even back then, the kernel community was at least interested, but it's been a long time since then.
It hasn't been a long time since then, Wes. It's like the difference between people years and dog years. It takes a while to get an entirely new project incorporated into the literal Linux kernel. You can't just call up your buddy and say, hey, man, go ahead and shoehorn this into the next one. Doesn't work that way.
It's certainly something I've been looking forward to. I mean, it's not to say WireGuard is hard to use now. There's tons of different ways to consume it on mobile devices, on Linux, on other operating systems, and including userland implementations. And it's definitely one of the better behaved DKMS modules I've ever used. But having it in the mainline kernel will just make everything smoother, easier, and mean it'll stick around and be maintained for years to come. That said, just because it makes it into mainline doesn't necessarily mean it'll be on a kernel running near you at the same time. Any ideas about when we might actually see WireGuard on a distribution that is widely used?
Yeah, I think it's just going to be a little bit too late to make it into the next Ubuntu LTS. Ubuntu is one of the faster moving mainstream distros, and 2004 is coming up, but I don't think 5.6 is going to be ready. We're probably going to be looking at 5.6 going into release candidate status at about the same time that the Ubuntu 2004 is. So 2004 is probably going to be on a 5.4 or 5.5 kernel. Donenfeld, the original founding developer for WireGuard, he has offered on Ubuntu's mailing list, he offered to do backport work to put WireGuard specifically into canonical 5.4 or 5.5 kernels if they wanted to. No idea if they're going to take him up on that or not.
Oh, that's nice. Well, I'm going to selfishly hope so. Even if it doesn't make sense for the larger community out there, I've just fallen in love with WireGuard.
Well, I got to admit, I'm absolutely looking forward to not having to mess with, DKMS loadable kernel modules, because there have been a couple of times that, a kernel module has gone a little wonky and I've ended up without my WireGuard interface after a reboot. That's been a little bit annoying, and that will go away once it's in the mainline kernel. But I think ultimately this is not so much, great news for us as already WireGuard users. It is a great news for the WireGuard project, because being built into the kernel right from the get-go, that's going to have to increase adoption.
That is a great point. And included in this update was another piece of interesting good news. It sounds like WireGuard 1.0, a stable release, is on its way out soon.
It's hard to tell exactly when soon means, but Jason did mention in the comments on Y Combinator Hacker News, he said that a 1.0 release is on the horizon.
Well, color me excited, and when that's out, I'm sure we'll be talking about it again right here on TechSNAP. That'll bring us to the end of this week's episode, but don't worry, you can get more TechSNAP over at techsnap.systems, including the full show notes for everything we've talked about today at techsnap.systems/418. I'd also like to remind you to head on over to learn.linuxacademy.com/Jupiter to take advantage of our Black Friday sale and save $150 off a full year of unlimited hands-on online training. That's learn.linuxacademy.com/Jupiter. If you'd like more Jupiter Broadcasting productions, just head on over to jupiterbroadcasting.com. In particular, I'd recommend checking out User, Error, and Linux headlines. If you'd like more Jim, well, you can find him writing over at ours. And he's on Twitter. Jim, you're
at JRSSNet.
I'm there too. I'm at Wes Payne, and the whole network is at Jupiter Signal. Thank you so much for joining us.
See you in a couple weeks, everybody.